My name is Rebecca Davis. I'm a journalist for the Daily Maverick, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. Thanks for supporting authors and books and the wonderful book lounge, which we all love. It's my pleasure to be here tonight with three people I really have tremendous personal respect for, which is not something you always say on these stages. I once had to moderate a panel with Gareth Cliff, so there's that. No, I was thinking about these three earlier, and without getting cheesy, I was reflecting on the fact that they sort of represent kind of the best and the brightest that South Africa has to offer. Involved in very different spheres. They're involved in very different spheres, but I think the golden thread that binds the three of them is fundamentally activist hearts. I hope you guys would all agree. And also all three very, very talented writers, and all three have books which will be available for sale later, so please do find them, seek them out, and make them sign your books. So we have anti-apartheid activist, academic, lawyer, and businessman Oyama Mabandla on the far left. Feminist activist, researcher, and author Joy Watson in the middle. Revolutionary theologian, I actually don't know if that's the right term, but I've always wanted to say that. Revolutionary theologian, Methodist Church minister, former Alan Storey. Thank you so much for being here. Now, you are all three South Africans who I feel grapple very, very thoughtfully with social and political issues in your work and your writing, your praxis, one might say. So I thought we would just kick off with a bit of a general temperature check about how we're all sort of feeling about where we are at the moment. It's been an absolutely crazy year, right? I don't know if you guys saw actually that the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, has announced that Christmas is going to be in October. Did you see that? Basically, the country is being roiled by protest, and he's like, you know what, we'll sweeten things. Let's just move Christmas to October. And I have to admit, I read that and I thought, fuck, I'll have a bit of that. Just bring December on, really. I mean, it has been that sort of a year. There's been a lot happening. I don't want to move to Venezuela necessarily, but how do we feel, basically, about where we're at the moment? Government of national unity, these unprecedented electoral results. Is there room for tentative optimism, full-blown optimism, no optimism? Oyama, do you want to take a first bite at that?
Yeah, surprisingly, I'm actually feeling very optimistic about our country. I think what we saw in May, even the seismic, tectonic shifts that happened in May, with the ANC losing its majority for the first time in 30 years, bespoke, our people, the electorate, finally saying something about the state of this country. Now, I need to caution I need to put some guardrails on my optimism, to say at the same time, only 39% of our people bothered to vote, which clearly spells the massive alienation, disaffection, which we should all be concerned with. So yes, there were these changes. The ANC, lost its impregnable, place in our people's hearts. It's still in government, and it doesn't seem to me that it has learnt the lesson of the shellacking in May. I mean, they gave themselves 80% of cabinet seats. It doesn't seem to me that these are people who actually are responding to the populace out there that has said, we're voting, we're only giving you 39.7 of our vote. So from 39.7 of our vote, you give yourself 80% of the cabinet seats. Doesn't seem to me to suggest that they have learned anything. Now, if the ANC, if I'm correct that they've learned nothing, then they will get pulverized come 2029. And perhaps we may have a new politics. That's what I desire, actually, for this country. That we dispense with the pieties of the last century and we forge and form a new politics for our country, for the times we're in. It's the notion that folks, you know, who had engaged in a struggle, heroic struggle, I must say. I mean, we all did. We all engaged heroically in this struggle. It's not just the ANC. But the ANC was, of course, rewarded because of the kind of people it had in its rank. I mean, the wattage of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Chris Hani, you know, you name them. I mean, these were powerful personages. These were moral exemplars. And in a sense, the ANC has been living on that equity. You know, it has been expanding that equity. So the question is, when the ANC now has finished that equity, you know, I mean, with the type of leaders that they have, with Jacob Zuma, and what he did for this country, why should our people keep voting them back into power? I mean, this is almost like masochistic. You know, people are behaving badly, and we keep voting for them. So in a sense, we've said that's not going to happen now, and I believe if the ANC, as I say, hasn't derived lesson from what happened May 29th, it will be utterly pulverized in 2029. But what is on the other side? The DA and the other parties. I had hoped that Rise Mzansi would do much better.
As did we all.
You know, because it's a party of young people. So it's a kind that can be a repository of the kind of politics this country needs. Breaking out of these racial lagers, young people who are the majority cohort in our country. I mean, young people are the majority in our country. And they have not been engaging with the political project. They are the folks actually who don't vote. So having a party like Rise Mzansi, you know, I had thought it would actually dynamize, engage the passions and the interests of young people. It didn't, you know, and the question is out there why, and maybe we will get an answer by the end of this evening. But I must say, I know I'm probably a heretic here, you know, to suggest, I think the government of national unity was the best thing that could happen in our country at this juncture. Because the opposite would have been folk populists in the ANC trying to form an alliance between the ANC and Zuma's party, MKP, and EFF. What some have called the Chernobyl option. And I think that's what would have happened. You know, because you've actually taken folks who got this country into this sorry state it is. Zuma, Malema, you name them, and you know, combining them with malfeasance and troglodytes in the ANC, you know, then it would have been utter ruin for our country. So I think this is a precious moment. Hopefully that we can shape into a victorious lap for our country. This government of national unity, if it works, you know, could be the salvation that this country needs. You know, to have the party that represents majority aspiration, the aspiration of the majority, I mean, that's ANC, at least historically, and the party of capital and white privilege coming together to forge a new South Africa. I think that's something that we should all cheer. That the ANC is now having that dialectical relationship. You know, the majority is having a dialectical relationship with the privileged. And why do we need the privilege? Why do we need capital? We need capital because we have got 2% unemployment in this country. And until we actually have a relationship with capital, collusive relationship with capital, colluding and colliding, this country will go under. In a sense, under Thabo Mbeki we had that. You know, this economy was growing at 3.6% between 1994 and 2009. 3.6% on an average. 6 million jobs were created. So the notion that it was a jobless growth is a fallacy. 6 million jobs were created. We got out of junk status that the National Party and apartheid criminals had plunged us into in 2001. The black middle class exploded. For 3 years at the end of Mbeki's reign, this economy was growing at 5%, something that it had not attained since 1965. And for the last 2 years, we had a budget surplus, something this country has never had since its founding in 1910. So surely something was going right. And the ANC, I'm not saying Thabo should have been there forever, but something was going well in this country. And then we decided to invest in a dystopian turn with the election of Zuma, to the hem of the ANC, and then the ruination, that unfolded after that. So, Rebecca, I'm saying, I think I'm long-winded here. I'm saying, I think with this election, we have had people say we are not happy with pretty much all of you. So you need to do something, about that.
Yeah.
And it is my conviction that that will happen.
Thank you so much, Oyama. Joy, if you could be roughly 10 times as short-winded as Oyama, that would be...
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
What he said.
Wonderful. Alan? Okay.
So, I'm cautiously optimistic, Rebecca. I have spent 20-odd years working very closely in the policy space and working with politicians. And I think that one of the design elements of our democracy, of Parliament being meant to hold the executive to account, to scrutinize budgets, service delivery, was the fact that you had Parliament vested with an oversight responsibility that in effect really was just theoretical, because your chairpersons of committees are more junior members of the party, and they have to hold to account ministries who are headed up by more senior members of the ANC. And I've seen that play out over the course of 20-odd years, where it's impossible really to hold the executive accountable in that context. And so you have Parliament as a failed institution. I mean, I remember actually around 2018 or so being asked by Parliament to work on writing. They said, you write nicely, Joy. Write us some beautiful text for a nice, beautiful coffee book table on celebrating Parliament. And I was like, are you serious? Who's going to put that on their coffee table? Like, literally, we are the people who defended the fire pools and so on. And so now there is this interesting moment where you have this GNU, and it opens up opportunity for different things to happen. I think, having said that the cost of the state capture project has been tremendous, and the Zondo Commission and other initiatives have tried to quantify that. But I think that, we try and look at sort of the costs of the money that we lost that was stolen, etc., and we don't tend to look at the costs, the opportunistic things that could have unfolded if we did not have a captured state. And so I think that has sort of set us 10,000 steps back, and it does not help that the Zondo Commission, we've got this beautiful, and let's just celebrate this, right? Nowhere in the world has there been a commission that has in such a detailed way, investigated and articulated and documented state captured. Like, this is a bright shining star example. It's a model of best practice, but it's not worth the money that was spent on it and the paper it's written on if it continues to be a paper tiger where like 80% of its recommendations have not been acted on, and the convictions for criminality have been very slow to follow.
Absolutely. Thank you. Alan, your take?
I'm still concerned about Jesus' birthday being changed from December to...
Imagine, sorry, that must be triggering for you. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
My colleagues are going to have to figure out sermons, but okay. From my tradition, the question of optimism is not a big question. is the glass half empty or half full? The truthful answer is both. When you say it's half empty, at the same time, it's actually half full as well. So for me, the question is around truth. And to the extent that we are truthful about where we are, that is very helpful. And if it's helpful, it's hopeful. So for me, the question is around, if you're asking around hope and optimism about where we are in a country, to the extent that we are being truthful about where we are, that is to the extent that I'm hopeful. And I mean, how can, to be able to, about optimistic, the levels of unemployment, the levels of poverty, the levels of violence, when gender-based violence is an euphemism, it's a war against women in this country. How, what is optimism? But to the extent that we're truthful about locating ourselves in all its grim detail, that gives me hope.
Alan, you've written a book, which is wonderful, by the way, called The Bells, Banners and Blasphemy. So I'm sure, as many of you know, during Alan's really very inspiring tenure, and I say this as an atheist, as the Methodist minister in Central Cape Town, for a long time there were banners which would be kind of unfurled from the Methodist church down the road, bearing political slogans very, very powerfully. You've now written a wonderful book about that. Can you just, for the benefit of the audience who might not be aware of the project, just explain a bit about how this project came to be and kind of its valency in a place where religious leaders all too often do not take political stances?
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, it's a small community on Green Market Square, and you ask yourself the question, what can you do with what little we have? And we've got this giant phallic steeple on Green Market Square where everyone stops and takes a photograph of. And one day we saw that there used to be taxis parked outside with their little yellow and black sign, taxi. And we thought we'd put up a sign, and it was mainly inspired by civil society. I must say that in the 15 years I was at CMM, the people who helped me more take my own tradition seriously were civil society. I'm not going to riddle off, but Right to Know campaign was the first of saying, well, what can you do? And it was our asking, how can we enter into solidarity with these incredible people doing incredible campaigns? Social Justice Coalition, you name it, just amazing people doing amazing things. And we decided to kind of put these tweets up, on yellow. And the idea was to theologize them, so that people who identify as Christian can be politicized, and those from a political perspective can not be religiousized, but...
Didn't work on me.
Yeah, we know.
They're still trying.
Steady on. Yeah.
So that was the relationship, and to actually say that there isn't a gap. They're not, the one should be the other. So, and to speak into that, so the tradition that I was born into in this country, the incredible irony in this country was that apartheid was based, misrepresenting on the Bible, and those inspired to take on apartheid were also inspired by the same text. And that's the paradox. And that's the truth of religion. It can be used to bring ill or to bring good. Right. But let's take the church in the last 30 years. We've been absolutely silent. Yeah. We have this incredible history. And in the last 30 years, it's been civil society, it's been journalists. You are the prophets. The prophets have not come from the pulpit in the last 30 years. An example is that when a political leader can say an election has been stolen, as Zuma did the other day, and we know it's a complete lie. He has no basis on anything to say that. It's complete fabrication. Not a single church leader called him out to be a liar. Now, back in the day, 30 years ago, you would have had a chuckling tutu.
Yeah.
Tell him what for.
Yeah.
So that's the indictment of every segment of society, and I'm in this particular segment. We need to take a deep look on ourselves and ask ourselves, how are we part of the problem? because our silence is what's perpetuating the things that have been articulated.
Oyama, I want to take you in here. In your book, Soul of a Nation, A Quest for the Rebirth of South Africa's Values, one of the reasons this book is wonderful, by the way, is because this man writes like a jazz cat. He writes like Damon Runyon. It's like one of those incredible old drum writers. I cannot wait for your memoir. But he offers this really strong diagnosis of the country's issues and also, I think, a necessary pushback about some of the myths of the current era. But one of the things you say, which fits into what Alan's saying here, is that in looking to sort of restore our path as a nation, we should be looking more to faith institutions, to morality, to spirituality. What do you have in mind there?
You know, I was telling someone about what Alan's father said after the passing of the arch. And he tells a story about the two of them being abducted from a hotel in Venda. I think they'd gone there for some work or whatever they were doing there. But at midnight, they are abducted. And these guys, they take them to an open field, and, you know, they've got guns and all of this. And they say, you know, we can shoot you here, and no one will ever know what happened to you. He says, at that moment, the arch, you know, this is, you know, Bishop's story. He says, the arch has such a profound belief. He says he's a man of faith. He's not just a theologian. He's a deeply religious human being. He says he went down on his knees and says, God, if this is your wish, if this has to be our fate, let us face it with grace and humility. Let us, if you've authored this, this will be our denouement. This is how we're going to go. Let's accept that as your wish. He says the goons vaporized. They ran. And then he turns to Peter's story and says, damn, Peter, I was shit scared, man. I almost crapped my pants. You know? So, you know, in a sense, what I'm saying is that the struggle was a spiritual enterprise. You know, when young people, you know, took up stones and engaged, you know, with an army that was, you know, as well armed as the South African army, what was driving those young people? Something deeper than themselves. They transcended the self, you know, which is what ultimate spirituality is about, you know, the transcendence of self. When Nelson Mandela dares the apartheid judge and say, this is what I had wished to live for, and if need be, this is what I'm prepared to die. That was something. Mandela had transcended herself. Now, this is something that is not well known, but Bram Fischer, who was their counsel at Trivonia, told later on Thabo Mbeki to say, you know, Thabo, this is before the end of the trial. So Bram Fischer is in England representing, doing some work for Anglo-Americans. So think about this. He's doing work for Anglo-Americans, he's doing work for Nelson Mandela, he's involved in the underground of the Communist Party. But he had gone to Oxford, he was a silk, from Oxford. So he could play all of those roles. At any rate, Bram Fischer tells a young Thabo Mbeki, Thabo, we expect your dad and his comrades to die. Because, these guys never denied the charge. And this was a capital charge. They tried to overthrow the state. They simply explained why they did it. And he says, they are guilty as charged. So they are going to face death. And you know what they've said to us? They said, no appeal. No appeal. We want to go down as martyrs so that our people can pick up with the spear, the fallen spear, and engage with the struggle. So this is the type of, if you like, spiritual zeal that we need for the times we are in. to transform, our social ills. I mean, the thing that Alan is talking about, they need to be engaged with the same kind of spiritual zeal. And we need to remind each other how we actually arrived at the moment, at the rendezvous with freedom. We did so because we looked after each other. We were our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper. We were comrades in a common battle for freedom. Now, it's difficult, I guess, to summon the same kind of zeal in conditions of freedom. But I think we are in an emergency in this country. I think Alan is right. We're in an emergency, and I think, social movements must again, I mean, they are there, but they must again, foster the same kind of spiritual zeal that won us our freedom. That's what I'm talking about.
Joy, as feminists, I think we often hear talk about return to values and morality, and our hackles raise a little, right? I mean, let's never forget that Zuma was, after all, the head of the moral regeneration movement, and often this goes together with a kind of, traditional values means something which often is not very wonderful for feminism. What is your take on that?
So I was listening to Alan and Oyama speak and feeling very inspired and being able to transcend beyond myself and my sense of spirit. But I also would like to do my punting now, Rebecca, if I may. Folks, welcome to the Church of Feminism. We do the work. So just if I might just say that the literature on kind of feminist engagement with post-colonial states on this continent has always been highly freaking evolved, far better than the global north. You think about terms like intersectionality, which is the intersection of gender and race and blah, 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 blahs. We had that. We didn't even need the label for that. We were thinking about that long before it became a thing. So we just hashtag so tomorrow. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, a group of us got together, and it was really special in having people who were part of writing were part of the Women's National Coalition and were part of writing the Constitution and insisting that certain things are inserted in there, and then having a generation of youngerish women like me, and then much, much younger than me, and reflecting on where do we stand in terms of the democratic project, and where do we stand in terms of the gross failure of relying on the institutions of the state to bring these moments of spiritual transcendence. And I mean, this is hard for me to say as somebody who kind of believed in the notion of state feminism, that there was this thing that some of us would position ourselves on the outside of the state and work to be in collaboration with the state when the moment required, but to also then be in contestation with the state when those moments required. And then some of us would work on the inside of the state and do the stuff that I was trying to do, which really leads to serious mental health problems. I wouldn't advise it for anyone. And it's very complicated because on the one hand, it comes, I have to look back at the kind of past 20 odd years through the prism of my privilege, that working in the state brought a kind of middle-class life that my foremothers and fathers did not have. Right. But at the same time, it's this exercise in, oh my God, actually what have I achieved? And I don't want to oversimplify that, because there are moments where there were incursions for transformative actions, like planting ideas and the activism coming from the outside and working in collaboration. I mean, one example was working with a deeply religious multi-party women's caucus who there was no scope for the decriminalization of sex work, absolutely, moral higher ground on that. And over years, changing that stance by just engaging with the women of this country and listening to what they need and want, which is full decriminalization. Of course, the men in the ANC kind of hijacked that project, and we had a moment where it was adopted as a resolution because of the work done with the Women's Caucus and the ANC women. And it was published as a resolution after an ANC conference, but then magically disappeared because the men in the ANC had changed their mind on it. So, and just briefly also mention that the big irony is that we had the equality clause in the Constitution, like there were certain gains that we made around gender discrimination and the establishment of the Commission for Gender Equality, we were given that in exchange for a platform for traditional leaders. So this was the negotiation that happened. That if you have, if you feminists like want something, here's your present, and then also let's have Controlesa. And I think that, you know, in my feminism, I'm very aware that we have to work with people where they are at, and our country is deeply religious and in some ways deeply conservative. And I think that you have to work with that, and the faith community is an important entry point into where people are, but that does not mean that we don't challenge where religion and culture become holy grails that stand in the way of living out your right to human rights, basically.
Right. So that brings me to something I want to ask all three of you, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, actually. And it's about the Constitution, which you also write about, Oyama, because you feel Ramaphosa is not pushing back enough on the critique. So we've seen the emergence of these right-wing parties, the most extreme, or the most successful of which is the MK party, right? But there is definitely a trend towards the emergence of these parties. We have a very liberal constitution, the most liberal in the world by some measures. What if that constitution does not, in fact, reflect the will of the people? Should we be concerned about that?
Recently, I attended a discussion with advocate Ngugai Toby. You all know him, eh? And he was essentially talking about the Constitution and the malcontents. He actually says, I mean, he comes up with an excursion, the history of constitution making in this country. The ANC, you know, a guy called Richard Msimang wrote the ANC's constitution in 1918. In 1922, he wrote the Bill of Rights. In 1944, the ANC wrote something called African Claims, you know, which is another Bill of Rights, which ultimately finds expression in the Freedom Charter in 1955. So essentially, the Constitution is a product of all those years, a product of that spectrum of ideation. So the notion that the Constitution is foreign, does not reflect our values, it's a foreign imposition or imposed by white liberals, is false. That's what this guy was able to present. I think there is nothing, you know, Rebecca, in the Constitution that affronts, you know, the populace. Nothing.
Do you think the majority of the populace supports abortion and gay rights?
I think the majority of the people support institutions of our democracy. And if those institutions of our democracy, including their constitution, say we are going to constitutionalize, enshrine, you know, sexual orientation rights, which we're the only constitution in the world, actually, that has done that, by the way. And does it affront some people? Yes, of course it does. But there's a whole point, you know, constitutions are counter-majoritarian. You know? They are not driven by the populace. Well, the populace, at any given stage, the populace whims change, which is why we have governments changing all the time. So there ought to be something that is above politics, that reflects our values, foundationally. Who are we? And I think we find that in the Constitution. As I say, getting to that place in 1996, you know, when the Constitution was accepted, was a long struggle, you know, for women's rights, for sexual orientation rights, for political rights. And yes, you know, the Constitution is never, it should never be about polling people. Do you want the death penalty? You know, because if you do that, then you will be subscribing to populism. And we chose to go beyond populism by having something that we could all agree represented the values, the best values amongst us.
I think I would agree with that. I think one of the gift of our Constitution being so enlightening, so progressive, was in direct relation to the context in which it was born, which was so regressive.
Yes.
And because it was born right on the cusp of the people who sat down to write the Constitution remember what a sjambok felt like, and some didn't have both arms to write it with. So there's a memory of what injustice really does to people, what oppression really does. And so when that is still so vivid, you make sure that when you write something down, you write to counter that. And then the question is, well, do I counter it just for myself? And someone raises a question, well, what about them? And then someone says, well, if I know what it feels like, they're still saying that feels exactly what you're saying it felt like. And so they broaden it out. And were the Constitution written today, we'd have a different Constitution. Absolutely. Because the memory of that pain would not be informing every single pen stroke. It would be forming, the question would be, how do we secure power, not how do we protect the vulnerable?
Yeah.
And so the Constitution doesn't, you know, we know you can't eat the Constitution. We know that. The Constitution, let's take land. The question is the Constitution preventing us doing land justice? The answer is no.
Yes.
The Constitution's not the problem. We've got a host of other things. Sure. So we can blame the Constitution as a scapegoat, but in actual fact, it's us. The law around sex work and decriminalize, that is the problem. So it seems that our prejudice towards sex workers is to such a degree that we do not believe sex workers need the freedom of everyone else and the protections that everyone else has. And the religious institutions are at the forefront of that prejudice. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the hypocrisy of religion and sex is profound. It's been from the beginning, and that has to be challenged. And what one would hope is that institutions like religious institutions would ask the question around where are they the problem in this. And that whole adage of nothing about us without us, the religious is exactly the opposite. Everything about them without them. That's how they make it. And to be able to challenge and change that. So the Constitution for me is this incredible gift that has come out of it's such an incredible gift because it's come out of such incredible pain.
Sure. Joy, I want to ask you something a little bit different. Sorry, Oyama.
Yes.
And that's that we've seen the emergence of the MK party, obviously on the right, and then simultaneously we've seen this drift from the DA, for instance, towards adopting this kind of alt-right very American style politics, which is obsessed with what is it obsessed with, really? It's obsessed with, you know, condemning the use of pronouns and the rest of it. It's this idea that, like, all kinds of identity politics are abhorrent, except when white people feel something about their identity, and then it's not identity politics, it's just being. But do you think that has any relevance to the South African context? So I always wonder about this. Are ordinary South Africans at all absorbed in those American-style identity politics debates?
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, I think that when it comes to identity politics in our country, I mean, the one thing that I love about this country is that we're highly politicized, right? I mean, we have to be, our history requires it of us. Our ancestors demanded of us to be politicized and to not be politically dormant, but to be active in some ways. And I think that when it comes to the politics of identity construction, here, we've got a very vibrant, edgy, lacquer crowd of young people who are actively mobilizing in that space and demanding that, regardless, I think, of what's happening in other global spaces, to find an indigenized way of embracing different forms of identity. And I mean, you know, I think that the beauty of this is manifest in how, you know, and I look at where I come from as a child, brought up in really sort of tight Christian confines, like we were told women don't move out until they get married, you don't have sex until you get married. So I broke that one. I felt very guilty at the time. It was a big mistake.
Alan will forgive you.
Yeah, thank you. Sure, it's a lot of my soul. This has turned into a whole confession session. But now, like you look at young kids, my daughter, when I was a stepmom, and how there's almost this coolness, like they're so gender fluid. They experiment with women, with men, you know, they trans and they're not. And I think that, you know, not to take away from when that is real, like that is the gift of what we have given in terms of, and this is the one thing that I think that the ANC has really gotten right, is to create the social context for people to, in some ways, you know, within limitations, to claim identity, the politics of identity, and to say who you are, and to say, I demand to be seen and to be heard, and I'm a human being. And so I think that, you know, being, you know, and this is now, Mervyn can pay me for this, I'm punting the poetry slam on Sunday night. It's a space for young people, and it really is, I mean, you know, coming into that, I always have goosebumps because it's poetry. But these are not necessarily your established poets. Like, they are young people who are given a space, and they speak to poetry. They breathe the political, the personal, the political into their personal stories, and it is everything that we need to know. And also, Rebecca, I'm just saying now quickly that you promised me that I could punt my book, even though we're in a neoliberal framework where we just don't do this shit. But
I think it's all we do.
The socialist in me is going to say, please buy this. This is a collection of stories from predominantly young black South Africans who would not ordinarily have the opportunity to be published. My English is leaving me now. And I asked them to tell me a story about being in democracy and a story of social equity or inequity. And you know, so we're talking about the Constitution. On the one hand, we have this progressive piece of paper that is really effervescent in its light. But at the same time, we have the juxtapositioning of these stories, and they're stories that break your heart. When I received them, I was not able to read them in one go. It demands a process of absorption, because it speaks to how democracy has failed young people in this country, and but yet they have hope and resilience, and they claim agency.
Amazing. Sounds like a light read.
Yeah, totally.
I just want to ask Oyama one more thing, and then I'm going to take it to you guys for questions, because I know there'll be a lot. Sorry, Joy. That sounds like an amazing book. It really does. Oyama, can I just ask you one thing? It's topical. So today we saw the Justice Minister in Parliament, right? She was defending the 500 million rand loan she took from VBS, right? I'm asking you this because one of the things you rail about in your book is the way in which South African society has been kind of become totally enthralled to this like hyper-consumerist, materialist society, as has most of the rest of the world. So I was kind of stunned listening to her, because the way she made it out, it was absolutely standard practice for someone in her line of work to be seeking loans the whole time, right? And I want to quote what she said so I don't misrepresent her. She said, I've requested a number of times, either from my brother or anybody, can you loan me money? This is the Justice Minister. She also turned to Athol Trollip from Action SA and said, I can ask you, Honourable Trollip, can you borrow me money on Friday? On Thursday, maybe you kill your mum the following week. So she was saying, obviously you just scattergun asking people for money, and then maybe they do something bad, but you're not to know at the time when you're like hitting them up for a loan. The serious question is, should we be asking questions about what you need all this money for? And genuinely, because this is somebody who's been on a plus million rands annual salary for at least 15 years. She was the head of Salga, she was the mayor of Polokwane, she's been a minister in 2 separate administrations, right? And then she sort of revealed what she needed the money for. She said that she needed the loan because she was going to start this coffee shop in Sandton in order to employ her friends and family members, because she couldn't do that in her capacity as the mayor of Polokwane. No, it's valid because of the Public Finance Management Act, because you can't be doling out municipal jobs to your nearest and dearest. So you need to find, she was saying you need to find a different outlet, right? So in other words, it was because of what is colloquially known as black tax, right? The obligation to support a much wider community than those of us who are white, for instance, often have to. Should we bear that in mind when we analyze this kind of event? It's a genuine question, because it got me thinking, like, am I coming at this completely wrong? Should I have more compassion for somebody in this position who nonetheless still clearly has to support a huge community?
And by engaging in criminality?
Well, unclear as yet.
No. I think, the notion of communal, mutual support is indeed a foundational in black society, or for that matter, in many other societies. But there has never been a time when people felt that they have to break the law, they have to steal to benefit, their friends and loved ones. So culture, there's a lot of vulgarization of culture to explain bad things. I mean, Zuma used to marry every year and do all kinds of things and explain it as, this is my Zulu culture. In fact, Buthelezi once had to come down hard on him and said, that's vulgarization of our culture. We in fact, nobody marries a young girl, because the whole point of lobola, for example, is you have to show your ability to support someone else's daughter, that's why there's this lobola thing, it's supposed to be your ability to support this person. You're showcasing your ability to do so. So it's not something that should just be exploited at whim, and then you say, oh, it is my Zulu culture. I mean, that's what he said after raping, that lady, that sister, Kwezi. He used, his culture, vulgar, in a very vulgar way, to explain the wrong. And I think this is what is happening with this woman. People work, and we are basically told you must live within, your limits. Yeah. There's never a justification for thievery and crookedness in our culture. So this woman is actually playing, games with all of us, using this whole phenomenon of a black tax.
Yeah. Thank you, Oyama. All right, we've got 10 minutes for questions from you guys. We've got someone coming at the back with a mic. Someone in the front. Yes, Cameron. And sorry, we've got one halfway down there.
Sorry, this is my ritual apology. I'm sorry, it's not on. Is it on? Okay.
Yes.
This is my ritual apology for anyone who attends a lot of events, because I ask a question to every single event, but because I'm also part of the media, technically, for News24. Anyway.
They must love you.
Of course. I was going to say, first, if you're on R1 million plus salary for years, then I feel like you could just give that to instead of having to get a dodgy loan to make jobs, you could start a business with that money yourself. But also, what I find fascinating from my generation's perspective is that we have more reason to be proud of South Africa and its ideals and that than almost any other young generation in the world. Like, it's astonishing, and also like having lived through Feesm's fall and so forth, like we fought for it. We really took on the mantle and became that new generation and so I understand why people are despairing about the country at some level, but I don't understand why people are disillusioned, like we cannot get back to our principles. Why do you feel like there is a feeling that our principles aren't real or aren't things we can't fall back on in some way? Like,
Good question. What do you reckon, Alan? Want to take a stab at that?
Would you rephrase it?
I would hate to. God forbid. He's articulated it so beautifully. Why do you think there's a prevailing skepticism, disillusion? Yeah.
I mean, I can't answer that. I wouldn't know. What I would say, though, is the question of anger around... We have one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have the violence of poverty, which is the most extensive crime that's committed every single minute of every single day in this country. So forgive me for being too optimistic, like, okay, in that context. And that is man-made. I use the language deliberately, just before I get clobbered on either side here. Okay.
No, we totally agree. It's man-made.
Okay.
No argument.
So when we heard figures earlier of job increase and growth and employment, and then in the last 15 years, we have every right to be profoundly angry. That state capture has not just made a few individuals rich, it has left millions of people impoverished. That will dictate their entire lives, health, education, etc. So I really struggle with the optimisms. We have every day that this country does not burn up, I think is a miracle.
I have to agree.
Every single day that we wake up and it's not burning completely, for me, that's a miracle. And so there's an urgency for me. And where, I guess if you remember Tutu, he got so angry. Remember he said the ANC was worse than the apartheid. And he wasn't meaning, factually. He's saying the anger for him was so deep because we expected more. Because the people in power now know what it is like to go to bed hungry. And therefore, why do you need the equal education to have to take government to court to make sure that feeding continues during COVID? Why do people who understand hunger have to be taken to court to continue feeding? Now that speaks to some hollowness inside our being, that our humanity has been profoundly damaged in this country. And that's the restoration. I'm not sure I'd use the word spiritual because I think it's such a complicated thing. But we really need the restoration of that humanity. Sorry.
Joy, you wanted to jump in.
So very quickly, I think that the thing that is concerning for me, and it certainly is, we have a really active civil society, and this is the thing to watch, is that the state, and we just need to look at the number of service delivery protests, the state, the role of government is to deliver services of people, and there are a combination of things around why it can't do that. One is the state capture project that has impoverished the state. Two is the policy of austerity measures where we actually don't have money, and so we are skimming down on basic rights that people need access to, and you actually have to provide the money for. And so in the absence of the state doing its job, what we're increasingly seeing is the contracting out, without actually contracting out, is civil society and NGOs taking on the delivery of those state services. They are not financed to do so. So you look at women's shelters, for example, as one example. You look at Gift of the Givers dealing with malnutrition going up by 287% in Tuleni over a 5-year period. They are actually stepping in as governance structures to deliver the services to people because we have a government that is dysfunctional. And that is, last thing is that there are some institutions in the state that work beautifully. So we could be in such a worse mess if the Treasury had been captured, but it wasn't. Like, it stood its ground. The Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, also some moments of like, yay, some moments of not so great, but like we have to also celebrate the stuff that is there, the Auditor General's office, we have some institutions that we can utilize to kind of intensify the democratic project, but we have to be very vigilant about watching the ones that are fucking it up.
Absolutely right. Question?
Thank you. My question is for anyone, but I want to pick up on something you said, Joy, about enjoying how politicized South Africans are. And it's something I also like about this country. And you spend a small amount of time anywhere else in the world, and you find similar problems, but people don't talk about or engage in the same way. And so just a little, I've been involved a lot in the past year in activism in relation to Palestine. And you go to rallies and you hear people chanting and speaking. And you notice that when the language is about rejecting colonialism, there's a lot of loud applause. And when the language is about rejecting capitalism, there's less of that. I would say they're both systems of dominance that we should talk about and problematize. And so my question is really about whether or not this notion of us being politicized can itself become a trap, because it limits the ways in which we're not politicized, because there are certain influences in the spaces we're in that determine the limits of what it means to be politicized, and which systems of dominance we get to talk about and then say, yes, we check the box, we're politicized, versus which ones we don't talk about. And I think that's just, I just made one example, but I think there's many examples of we don't treat all systems of dominance as equally important to address in our politics. And so my question is, how do we shift that, and how do we stay conscious of that while celebrating that we are politicized?
These young white men are cooking, eh?
I can't do that clicking thing that the young people do, but yay. there someone's got it right. So, I'm really interested in this nexus between the personal and the political. And I think that essentially each of us, we're located in context, in situatedness, and we all have a story to tell. And I think that, when I start joining my story, for example, about being raped with another woman's story about having been raped, you start painting a picture of a communal story and a societal story and essentially a national story. And so essentially the personal is very political, and it requires of us to be cognizant of the ways in which it's political, and to be cognizant of the ways in which we look at our kind of national narrative and look at the inequities in our society, and to dream the vision into the future. I think that one of the biggest things that frustrated me about working in the state is that policy is vested in and anchored in measurement, because you have to measure change. And so we have a state that is so, in some ways as it should be, so deeply steeped in measuring shit, like indicators and targets and blah, blah, blah. At the same time, ultimately, what we need is a transformative, revolutionary project that changes the very nature of our society. And that is so transformative. It cannot be bound by indicators and targets. And we need the visionaries who can see beyond that, to see that transformation. You're not planning for a government term of 5 years. You're planning for the generations to come. And that's articulating a vision into the next 50 years. And if you're not dreaming that way, you're not going to get it right.
Guys, with regret, we do have to close there. Thank you so much. I said earlier that these three are the best and the brightest. I think you see what I mean. And a reminder also that we can just reject extremism while still remaining activists. And I think that's really inspiring. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. Thank you to the book club.
Thank you. It was lovely meeting you.